All right, welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to talk about how to animate the loader, where he's picking up these clips, dropping them into the feed, and just going on and on and on. So let's see how we do that. So for setting up, I've got the same character that I had in the seats here, but I've got him standing at a station here, kind of in a rest position. And the first thing to do is to define the motion of his hands. So we want his hands to kind of come up, over, and then drop down and drop a clip in there and then kind of come back down here by his waist where he can pick up another clip. So to do that, I want to use a curve, and I want to use a curved circle because it's a closed loop, and I can just scale that down and just move it over here and I'll leave it about there. Go into edit mode, select everything, and I want more divisions, so I'm going to say subdivide, so I got some extra ones. And you can see here the curved direction goes this way, clockwise, which is the wrong direction for us. So with everything selected, I go in and say switch directions. And if you don't see these arrows, if you go up here and you look at this normals checkbox, that turns it on and off, and you can change the size of them that way. All right, so the next thing to do is to just rotate these and move them around. Oops. Rotate them and move them into the path that you want to have. I'm not going to do it all right now. I'm just going to give you an idea how this stuff goes. I'm going to grab these, maybe SX, scale them that way, do it this way. So what I'm going to do actually, I'm going to pause the video. Now you know how I'm actually moving these points around. I'm just going to pause the video and I'm going to finalize my path, and I'll come back in a second. All right, I'm back. This is my path that I created. I can see from the front, this is the shape it looks like. So the hands are going to come up, they're going to come over, going to drop a clip, and then they're going to come back down to his side. The next thing to do is to add a clip to the path and animate it. Now down here, I have a clip all ready to go. A couple things to note on this is that the origin of this clip is right here at the tip of the bullet. And also importantly is that the actual clip itself is at the origin, right? So we're at 0, 0, 0. That's important whenever you attach something to a path. All right, the next thing to do is to come down here to the constraints, and I want to add a follow path constraint, and we want to choose our path. See the loader curve, I call this loader curve. Choose the path, and then animate the path. And when you animate the path, you can see that our shells snap up to the path, and if we run the animation, we just scrub through it, you can see how they kind of run through that path there. But I don't want it to start up here. I actually want it to start down here. So if I select the path and I go down here to object data properties, select that, and then under the path and animation you have a couple of settings. You have frames and you have the evaluation time. So I know that I want this, I played this obviously ahead of time. I want this entire cycle to take 51 frames. That's what works for my simulation. Obviously yours would be different. So I'm going to put a 51 in here, and that's how it's going to pace it going around that circle. The next thing I want is I want the shells to start down here at the bottom. So if I scroll here, I'm just clicking and scrolling this, I found that in my simulation 18 works just fine. It puts the shells right at the bottom here for the beginning of the animation. And I want to keyframe this because if you remember from earlier on, the right gun fires first and the left gun fires second. So there needs to be a little bit of pause before this guy loads. This guy's going to load a little faster, he's going to load a little sooner, but this guy needs a pause. So I'm going to move my shells along the animation curve to 18. I'm going to keyframe that by hitting I. And I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to move it to frame, I think 7 works for my simulation. And then if I jump forward to frame 51, and I scroll this along here, and go all the way back down again for a full loop, I think like 69 works fine. All right, and then if I go to frame 51 here, I just want one more keyframe here. So what I've done here is these first 2 keyframes, just pause the animation at the beginning so that when I'm scrubbing, you can see here he's waiting, he's waiting, he's waiting. And at frame 7, the animation is going to start because I need it to correspond to the action of the left gun. And then the rounds come up, I come around, and then I've completed my cycle by frame 51. So that's where I came up with these numbers. Obviously, when you do your own animation, your number is going to be different, but that's the general effect. All right, the next thing to do is to connect his hands to the shells. So I'm going to do that with a couple of empties. I'm going to go into top view and I'm just going to put my cursor here for a second, and I'm going to put an empty, and I'm going to make it a little smaller so it's not quite so big. I'm going to put it here just for now, and I'm going to have one of these for each of his hands. So I'm going to move one, duplicate that, and put that there, and these are going to be parented to the to the shells. So if I go into edit mode and I select one vertex, say this is going to be where I'm going to actually parent this empty to that vertex. So if I go back and I select this, and then go into edit mode, and then I hit Control P, you can see you have a make vertex parent option. And that's going to pin or parent this empty to this vertex. We're going to do something similar down here by his hand. Maybe pick this one, go back into object mode and pick this second empty, shift select the shells, go into edit mode, Control P, and then also make that a vertex parent. So now if we scrub along our timeline, the empties should follow with the shells. All right. Now we need to tie our hands to these empties. So now if I go into the armature and then go into pose mode, and I select this is the IK bone. Remember from before, this is an IK rig, so this will control the entire arm. I take that bone and I go down to here under bone constraints and add a child of constraint, and then choose this empty here. Now if I go back out into object mode and I move this empty, I move his hand. So I can now go into top view, maybe move this over here, move it up, and I'm just putting his hand somewhere on the shell, so it looks like he's holding on. It's not going to be perfect because I don't have any real motion inside of the wrist here, but he's at a distance this will work fine. And I want to do the same thing with this other bone. So I go back into pose mode, select this IK handle here, add a child of constraint, and then choose the other empty. And now if I go into object mode, I can take this empty and maybe move his hand down here a little bit. Something like that. And now when we run the animation, you can see that his hands now follow along with the shells, and it looks like he's carrying them through there. The next thing we need to do to make sure this thing goes on infinitely is we need to make sure that the evaluation time is set to extrapolate to linear. So if I go up here, I got too many windows open, and we go to the graph editor, and we have the evaluation time. I right click on this and I say extrapolation mode, linear extrapolation. All right, that's going to tell Blender just to keep on going. So now if we play the animation, he's just going to keep feeding it through like that. Now obviously this looks weird because he's not actually letting go of the shells, right? He's just kind of dragging them through the side. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually modify the shader of the shells so that when they come through the side of the gun here, go back to the beginning, so that when they're visible, visible, and then right about there, when it starts to penetrate that edge, we're going to make them invisible, and they're going to remain invisible until they get down to about there, and then they'll pop back into visibility again. So it'll look like as if he's dropping it in. So let's take a look at the shaders for this shell. And I've got one on here. It's just a simplified principled shader with red color and metallic. It's just to make it easier for us to see what's going on. So what we want to do is we want to evaluate where these shells are on this loop. So let me hide some of the stuff, just to make it easier to see. So if we look at the loop and we look at our timeline, we're all the way back at the beginning. We're looking at our loop. We come down here. You can watch this number, this evaluation time. And as it goes on, that number increments the whole way around the animation. Now, unfortunately, it's not like a clock where we could just say that's 12 o'clock and that's 6 o'clock and It's just a cumulative number. But we can use this value inside of the shader to determine where on this loop the shells are. So let's start back here at the beginning. I'm going to select my shells. I'm just going to shrink that down because it's not really the important part here. Let's move it down here. So I have created a little group of nodes called between. All right, so this is a group that I've created. It takes a value inside and then it returns a 1 or a 0 if the number coming in here is between these two numbers. If it's greater than this number here and less than this number, then this utility outputs a 1. So taking a look at inside this, we can see that the value that you're comparing to comes in here and gets split to a less than or greater than node, and then it's compared. And if both of these are 1, if it's less than and it's greater than, then those multiplied together create a 1, which means that it's between the two values, so it outputs a 1. If it's not, if either one of these evaluates to 0, they multiply together, outputs a 0. So that's all that does. So that's just going to make our life a little bit, it's going to make our graphing a little bit neater having this thing, as opposed to having to do all these nodes over and over again. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get the data from this curve into our shader. So if I click on my curve, make these windows a little neater. So I got my curve selected and I have my evaluation time here, and I right click on this and I say copy data path. And then I go back to my shader for my shells and I add a input and a value. And here I can add a driver. So add driver. And if we go into the driver editor, take that value, hit N to turn on the tabs, go to drivers, and go all the way over here. Make these a little bigger so we can see what we're doing. And we want to choose the little DNA single property option. And we want to choose curve. And we're going to choose our curve. So I'm just going to click on my curve. And here I'm going to hit Control V and I'm going to paste that eval time that I copied. This is the result of that copy from the data path. So hit enter, and now you can see that there's 18, right? If we look at our path, its value is 18. If we look at our driver, you can see the value is 18. And then if we look back into our shader for these shells, we have that 18 value. And if we scroll through here, you can see that that number inside there changes. So what we can do now is we can, sorry about that, go back to the beginning, and we can compare this number to places where we want the shells to be either visible or invisible. So for example, right now the curve is at 18. We want it to be visible. So if we put our value and we plug it into our comparison, our between node, and here I want it to be, if it's greater than 18, we want it to be visible. Because this is greater, it's not a greater than or equal to, we need to put a value that's a little less than 18 in here just to make sure we capture that 18. So I'm going to put 17.9. And we want it to remain visible. Now if we just scrub here, come on, there we go. Just scrub here until we get to just about where it snaps over. So we're looking at, maybe we want it to disappear at 56.932, right? We want it, that's the last place we want it to be visible. But instead of putting 56.932 in here, we want to put something a little bit bigger because again, it's not greater than or equal to, it's just greater than. So I'm going to say 56.93. Right, that way we'll capture the, hopefully capture that 56.932. And then what we can do is we can add a mix node. So shader, mix, shader, put that in here. And I'm going to create a invisible or transparent shader. And the way this mix shader works is if it's 0, it's going to use the information from the top slot, and if it's a 1, it's going to use the information from the bottom slot. So what we're doing is we're creating a switch here, so it's one or the other. So invisible, visible. And the way this is going to work is if the shell or the clip is between these two numbers, it's going to return a 1, which means that it's going to, we want it to be visible, which means it's going to use this bottom shader, and we're going to see it rendered. If it's not between these two numbers, it's going to use the invisible or the transparent shader, and it's going to disappear. So let's take a render and see what it looks like. And I've colored these shells a bright red so we can see them. So we can see them outside the gun casing, and if we just scroll through our animation a little bit, they go up, they go over into the slots, and then they disappear. Probably stepped over it a little fast. So there they are at the final position, kind of dropping in, and if I go one more over, they disappear. And then they won't reappear again until they're outside the gun. But we need actually more of these nodes in order to do that. So I have actually gone ahead and made a whole bunch of these nodes to save some time. Let me get rid of that, and let me bring this over here, which is basically the same thing. We're using that driver going into the between nodes, and what I did is I just scrubbed through the animation a little bit at a time, and just capturing where I wanted it to disappear. So that was the first one, and I captured those numbers, and then I captured the second set of numbers, and the third set of numbers, etc. So I just went through the 240 frames and just determined the ranges of when the shell was supposed to be visible and not visible, and that's what all these betweens are. So that's what I just showed you. What's new here is this add function. So if the shells are in any of the positions where they're supposed to be visible, then one of these betweens is going to output a 1, and all the others are going to output 0. If the shell's in a position where it's supposed to be invisible, all of these betweens are going to output 0. The net result is if one of these returns 0, or a 1 rather, and then it adds through this cascade, the final output for this whole thing here is going to be 1. 1 being that the shells are in a position where we want to render them. If all of these are 0, then the final output of all these adds is going to be 0, and we're going to use the top shader here, the transparent shader. So now I can just take the shell shader and stick it on that one, and this stuff is just junk, because that's just demonstration purposes. All right, so that's what we got right now. So if the shell is ever in a position where it's supposed to be visible, the net result of all these adds is going to be a 1, which means use this bottom shader. Otherwise, we want it to be invisible because it's in this section here, and we just make it invisible. So if we bring this up and we render it, we should see the results of that. So it tracks up, comes over, drops in, disappears. Then tracks up. So that's going to be the motion, and that's how we actually make it look like the gunners are picking up the shells, dropping them in, and then going down for another set. And then obviously you're going to have to do the same thing for the other side of the gun. You can make a mirror image of this, and then just have to, all you do really at that point is just adjust the timing of this so that it matches with the recoil on the right gun barrel. All right, that is about it. I think the overall effect is fairly convincing when you're stepped back from the gun a bit. You can see the guys reaching down, picking up, dropping them into the gun. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about camera shake and how we make a realistic look from the gunner's point of view. All right, I'll see you there.